Hello and welcome to Arcs and Orcs Podcast by Sasha Wallace. For today's episode, I'm going to read you an article from the Journal of International Women's Studies from Bridgewater State University, Volume 17, Issue 1, Article 1, published in January 2016. The role of African traditional religion and Juju in human trafficking and its implications for anti-trafficking by May Ikeora. May Ikeora is an independent consultant with a general focus on gender, human trafficking, and peace building. May recently gained a PhD degree in law from the University of Hull, focusing on anti-human trafficking between the United Kingdom and Nigeria, and an MA in peace studies from the University of Bradford. She has over 9 years' experience working in related sectors at international, national, and grassroots levels in both the UK and Africa. May has first-hand experience advocating against the practice of human trafficking from Africa to Europe. I will be posting the link and/or the full article in the show notes and the description box. Abstract. This article examines the role that African traditional religion, or ATR, plays in giving ammunition to human trafficking, a role that serves as an emerging perspective in the understanding and critical engagement with this subject area. Elements within African traditional religion, popularly and wrongfully termed Juju, spelled Juju, proffer a method of control often used by certain traffickers to keep their victims in perpetual bondage. The data used in this article was derived from extensive fieldwork in Nigeria and the United Kingdom, UK, where 46 anti-trafficking stakeholders, including victims, were interviewed. The data indicates that this control mechanism was present in several cases of human trafficking from Nigeria, serving to impede effective investigations and the prosecution of traffickers. Consequently, the protection of victims has also been obstructed. This article hence asserts that trafficking should also be understood from the perspective of the belief systems of victims, one rooted in ATR rather than being attributed to brainwashing. It is also pertinent that policymakers and practitioners understand this emerging perspective if appropriate, and sustainable anti-trafficking measures are to be fashioned to stem the tide. Keywords in this article of note are human trafficking, Juju, African traditional religion, and oath-taking. It begins with a quote from Farrell Courtney. Traffickers take advantage of people's spiritual beliefs to force them into slavery. End quote. Introduction. Human trafficking has been explored from an array of perspectives, yet there are more discoveries to be made. As traffickers devise better means to exploit more people, anti-trafficking crusaders, including activists and governments, must be a step ahead in ensuring that they, the traffickers, are obstructed to prevent an increasing number of victims. The abuse of religious or cultural belief has been an ongoing tactic in today's slavery, utilized by traffickers mostly from Nigeria to victimize vulnerable people, specifically from Africa. Traffickers abuse the African traditional religious beliefs of their victims as a control mechanism. Within the rubric of trafficking, this form of control is not particularly new, as has been pointed out, not only in academic scholarships, but by the media at large. However, as this article intends to articulate, there has been a dearth of literature with a particular focus on this topic. The problem with the nature of this type of psychological control is that it hinders the protection, prosecution, and prevention of trafficking due to the limited knowledge of law enforcement authorities and relevant anti-trafficking practitioners in dealing with the peculiarities of cases within this particular context. The taxonomy of this method of control as Juju or voodoo is an unjustified reference to the discourse of human trafficking, being that traditional oath-taking is truly the main method utilized. Therefore, for the purpose of popular nomenclature and the clarity of argument, Juju will be interchangeably used throughout this paper in an attempt to provide a critical understanding of this nature of trafficking. Having shed light on the current form and scope of human trafficking, both the concepts of Juju and traditional oath-taking will be conceptualized and deconstructed within the context of ATR much later in this text. Human trafficking today, forms and scope. Over the last decade, there has been considerable growth in the literature on modern slavery, with substantial efforts made to capture the different experiences of victims of slavery around the world. Bales, 2000. In addition, there has been ongoing continuous awareness of the various quandaries uncovered within the rubric of contemporary slavery, Quirk 2000. Amongst the different forms of modern slavery, the subject of human trafficking has received renewed attention. The United Nations UN General Assembly established an intergovernmental ad hoc committee in December 1998 and charged it with developing a new international regime to fight transnational organized crime. UN Doc 1998. After 11 sessions involving over 120 participating states, the ad hoc committee concluded its work in October 2000 by establishing a regime against human trafficking. This latter led to a consensus as to what human trafficking consists or constitutes. It was subsequently defined within the United Nations Protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, supplementing the United Nations Convention against Transnational Organized Crime. The Trafficking Protocol defined human trafficking as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power, or of a position of vulnerability, or of giving of or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. This is the Trafficking Protocol 2000, Article 3. Three major elements emerge from this definition. Firstly, the act, which stipulates what was done. Secondly, the means, which simply illustrates how it was done. The means is omitted in a situation where a child is involved. Thirdly, the purpose, which specifies why it was done. The Trafficking Protocol provides the first international definition of trafficking as an explicit law enforcement regime. Bruges, 2004. It marks a significant milestone in international efforts to combat the problem of human trafficking and, to date, has attracted 147 signatories. Human trafficking affects both adults and children and takes the form of sexual exploitation, forced labour, domestic servitude, and organ harvesting, amongst other emerging forms of exploitations. Trafficking for sexual exploitation is one of the most discussed forms of trafficking, dominating most academic literature on the subject. According to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, since sexual trafficking is the most reported form of trafficking, it has been the most documented in comparison to other forms of trafficking that require similar attention. Although it is an area that has been overly emphasized, it does not cease to provoke moral consciousness following morality tales of women and girls who are sexually enslaved. Lee, 2011. Recent reports on human trafficking estimate that 80% of victims trafficked internationally are women, while 70% of these women are trafficked for sexual exploitation. From the International Labour Organization, ILO, 2012. Convictions for human trafficking have also been dominated by sexual exploitation offences, making up 90% of prosecutions. Piper, 2005. As part of sex trafficking, victims are forced to engage in all forms of sexual activities as sex workers in brothels, massage parlours, or wherever the trafficker deems fit for such business. Typically, victims of sex trafficking, especially from Nigeria, incur debt in the process of trafficking, which they are expected to repay before they can be freed. This includes money that has been invested to facilitate their migration and upkeep. The debt is usually outrageous, often ranging between $25,000 and $40,000, thereby keeping victims in a state of indebtedness until the trafficker has no further use for them. Human Rights Watch, 2000. Forced labour, on the other hand, involves all work and services that is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty, and for which the said person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. From the Forced Labour Convention of 1930. That should be updated. This menace of penalty includes threats of physical violence against a worker or relatives, physical confinement, and the denial of rights. According to the 2012 International Labour Organization's global estimate of forced labour, 20.9 million persons are affected globally, of which mostly adults are the victims. Similar to sex trafficking, they could also be in debt to their traffickers and having to work to buy off their freedom. The UN Supplementary Convention on the Abolition of Slavery, the Slave Trade, and practices similar to slavery also prohibits this form of labour debt bondage. The actions and outcomes that constitute forced labour within the Trafficking Protocol can also be found within the legal parameters of employment systems, hence the continuum of abuse in mainstream economic sectors. However, forced labour and workers' exploitation are not the same, due to the physical and/or psychological trauma associated with forced labour. Anderson and Rogaley, 2005. Although sometimes explored separately, domestic servitude often falls under forced labour. That is, where victims are forced to work in private households. Work often includes being forced to perform household tasks like housekeeping and childcare for little or no pay. Sometimes the victims have restricted access to movement outside the home in which they work. Children often fall into this category of exploitation, while the pattern often differs across cultures. In some cultures, the pattern often tends to fall in line with traditional fostering systems where children from poor families are taken to live with richer relatives or other family, to work as domestic help in exchange for a good education or an apprenticeship providing them with useful business skills. Mazonde, 2014. In such cases, these children are fully integrated members of the family, enjoying the privileges of the other members of the family without being abused. There is anecdotal evidence of the positive effects of the latter in supporting poorer families living in rural areas in Nigeria. For instance, so much so that the Nigerian Child Rights Act of 2003 has created allowance for such traditional input in fostering children. Unfortunately, such flexibility has created a loophole for traffickers to deceive parents into trafficking their children by promising them a better life. Once these children are trafficked for domestic servitude, they experience in many circumstances physical violence at the hands of their employers and, in extreme cases, sexual abuse. The Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, refers to domestic servitude as an invisible form of exploitation which is extremely difficult to detect due to the hidden nature of the work involved. The crime often takes place in the domestic sphere and as a result often goes undetected. It thereby lacks substantial data to quantify its prevalence. In addition to the common forms of human trafficking that have been briefly explored above, other forms of exploitation have emerged, including organ harvesting, baby harvesting, and trafficking for benefit fraud, all requiring extensive investigation. The underground nature of the operation and tactics used in trafficking, as well as the difficulty of victims to report the crime, has reinforced the hidden nature of this form of slavery. Consequently, measuring its prevalence has proved tough, with different organizations and scholars giving different estimates in the quest to quantify its scale. In doing so, statistics on human trafficking have suffered both from under- and overestimation as part of the limitation of this research area. According to Di Nicola, research in this area seems to languish, with the knowledge acquired appearing to be weak or of a piecemeal nature. Such deficiency in research affects directly or indirectly the caliber of existing policies, which are sometimes based on sentiments and political or dogmatic bias, rather than strong, substantiated research results. Bales's estimation of 27 million people currently in slavery continues to be widely used. But note, it is from a 2005 position. However, it combines all forms of modern slavery, of which human trafficking is only one component or part. That said, there seems to be differing global estimates, but no real figure as to the extent of human trafficking. Maggie Lee asserts that estimates on the prevalence of human trafficking may be manipulated for other purposes, such as enforcement agencies wishing to boost their efforts in combating illegal migration by securing more resources, or indeed to obscure failure. Lee, 2011. Such limitations in estimating the scale of trafficking interrogates the United Nations conclusion that trafficking is the third most lucrative business in the world, generating profits of over $31.6 billion annually, an estimation that suffers from limitations in the availability of accurate data. Thereby, basically, it's probably way higher than that by now, and in my personal opinion, Sasha's opinion, it is now the first lucrative business in the world. Back to the article. Furthermore, trafficking can take place internally within a country as well as across borders. According to Lasco in 2005, research on trafficking has been more concerned with international trafficking and less on internal trafficking in particular countries. Both areas of human trafficking appear to have been studied as if they were completely distinct and separate phenomena. Internal trafficking cannot be undermined as it is of a high prevalence. It is certainly cheaper than trans-border trafficking and affects far more people than we realize. The International Organization for Migration, the IOM, has described internal human trafficking as under-researched but essential to anti-human trafficking discourse. It is of high prevalence in comparison to cross-border trafficking and can often be a starting point for the latter in certain communities. Aronovitz, 2009. For instance, a report by the UN International Children's Emergency Fund, or UNICEF, 2007, indicates that human trafficking in India directly affects over 200,000 people, but within this figure, only about 10% of it is international trafficking. In spite of the overall understanding of human trafficking that has emerged from the increased level of research undertaken by various stakeholders, there are many dimensions of human trafficking that are yet to be articulated within this discourse. Lasco, 2005. Such dimensions include the emerging method of control that traffickers are employing in order to keep victims in exploitation as the main focus of this article. As part of articulating this method of control within human trafficking, 3 different case studies are presented below. These case studies illustrate reported incidences of human trafficking where traditional oath-taking has been used as an element of control. The 3 case studies outlined below will be used in this article as a reference for further discussions in terms of their significance to the victims and the anti-trafficking issue at large. Case Study 1. Unreported World in Nigeria. The journalist Jenny Kleeman reported on what she called black magic used to trap thousands of Nigerian women in sex slavery in the Independent article 2011. This was based on her documentary Unreported World, Nigeria, Sex Lies and Black Magic, broadcasted on UK television's Channel 4. It revealed that two categories of women were being trafficked. One type of woman was deceived into the human trafficking business, while the other was aware that she was being trafficked. During the interview, one of the girls vowed that no one was going to stop her dreams of making money in Europe. Vivian, as she was called in the film, insisted, "I've made up my mind that I will go there, and I must go there, the trafficking destination. I've chosen it." She had to take an oath to pledge her loyalty to her trafficker to pay back the debt assigned to her. Vivian was taken to a shrine run by a priest called Dr. Stanley, who instructed Vivian to undress and wash herself in the hut outside the shrine. When she finished, he blew chalk dust over her body and smeared clay over her forehead, marking her out so the spirits can identify the soul that is being offered to them. He then asked her to kneel before him to swear the oath. Of allegiance to her trafficker. Case study 2. The UK Osezua Oselase. In a recent case occurring in the United Kingdom in 2012, a Nigerian, Osezua Oselase, was convicted in the Canterbury Crown Court in the UK for inter alia trafficking of two young Nigerian orphan girls for sexual exploitation in The Guardian 2012. The victims were raped, sexually abused, and subjected to an oath-taking ritual to control them as victims of trafficking. It was reported that Oselase told the teenage girls that they would die or never bear children if they tried to escape or reveal what had happened to them. Part of the rituals performed on these girls included making tiny cuts with a razor blade on the chest of the victim and rubbing black powder into the bleeding wounds. Even though Oselase knew that he had HIV, he still raped the girls without using condoms. According to the Judge Williams who prosecuted him, "You were dealing in exploitation and manipulation and degradation. You are undoubtedly a very, very dishonest man. You are arrogant and manipulative. You are devoid of conscience, devoid of any compassion to your victims." Canterbury Crown Court. Case Study 3. The NAPTIP cases. The National Agency for Trafficking in Persons of Nigeria, the NATIP, also attributes the difficulty of the agency to prosecute traffickers due to the fact that the victims are afraid of Juju and are hardly forthcoming. Mojid, 2008. According to an officer of the agency, the girls are usually taken to shrines and made to take oaths of secrecy. When they arrive in their destination country, they are usually subjected to another round of oath-taking. The oath restrains them from testifying against their traffickers in court. The agency has given examples of several incidents where this has occurred. One of this is the case involving Sarah Okoye, who was charged with trafficking 6 girls to Spain for prostitution. The victims refused to show up in court to testify, virtually bringing the trial to a halt, due to their fear of the potency of the oath that they had taken. However, the agency was finally able to secure the conviction of Sarah Ikeora because it then successfully raided the shrine of the Juju priest who administered the oath. The Juju priest was compelled to testify against the trafficker, leading to her conviction. In a similar case involving one Constance Omoruri, the victims also failed to testify, and conviction was only secured because the chief priest who administered the oath testified against the trafficker in court. Nevertheless, it is quite unclear as to how this evidence reflected or re-established the role of the chief priest as an accomplice. The first case study depicts the complicity of vulnerable victims who agree to the oath-taking ritual in exchange for a better life in Europe, as is often promised by their traffickers. It also illustrates a clear case of the use of wrongful language to describe the problem. Kleeman, like many journalists who maintain a sentimentality attached to reporting this issue, project a negative image of the African culture. The use of the phrase black magic is tantamount to a projection of negative attributes and stereotypes onto magic. These signifiers of negativity can be linked with the Western construction and imagination of blackness, equivalent to a larger degree with Africanness itself. Nevertheless, in the light of these different case studies depicting the common use of oath-taking as a method of control, the next section will discuss the link between this form of control and its implications for victims and anti-trafficking as a whole. In view of the odd nature of this trafficking, especially for Western practitioners who are often challenged by these cases, there is a clear need to demystify the ambiguous understanding currently surrounding this practice. The continuing lack of awareness of the nature of this type of trafficking has been detrimental to anti-trafficking and the endeavours of activists to attain the necessary justice for victims of trafficking. Juju and human trafficking nexus. In recent times, the link between so-called Juju and trafficking of human beings has been featured in many trafficking cases, especially from Nigeria, as seen in the 3 case studies detailed above. Whilst there is scant existing research on such a link, it is a component of trafficking that has generated attention in human trafficking discourse, focusing on trafficking from Nigeria into other destination countries. Empirical data shows that while Juju can be used in this context of trafficking, it is actually the use of traditional oath-taking that is dominant. Both traditional oath-taking rituals and Juju are often used as a control mechanism to keep victims of trafficking in bondage and at the mercy of their traffickers. Traditional oath-taking often occurs as part of the recruitment process of human trafficking, as a contractual agreement between traffickers and their victims involving a myriad of rituals. This aspect of recruitment does not apply to all cases of trafficking, but seems to have taken the process of trafficking to a different dimension. In some cases, Juju serves as an indication as to whether the trafficker will continue with the trafficking process or not, particularly when we consider that it serves as a source of security for the trafficker. However, in some cases, the oath-taking occurs in the destination country. The words in Pidgin English of a survivor, Mary, 19 years old, are very potent here, trafficked as she was from Nigeria to the Republic of Benin. When I reach there, I swear make I no implicate her. I swear that I cannot send money home or tell anybody about the work you are doing until you pay your debt. This was translated as, when I got there, I swore not to implicate her, the trafficker. I swore that I would not send money home nor tell anyone about the work that I have undertaken until I pay my debt. Mostly the oath-taking ritual happens in the source country, with some common rites performed on the victims. According to Gabadmosi 2006, and consistent with the case studies outlined earlier, this ritual often requires personal clothing of the victims, their blood, their pubic hair, their fingernails, etc. During field research on human trafficking in Nigeria, where victims of trafficking are interviewed, they confirmed similar accounts of items being taken from their bodies. Some of these victims also mentioned the use of their underwear, lingerie, in the ritual. The entire scenario of the ritual generates an aura of fear, coupled with the rites, which can be rather violent. The implications being of breaking the contract are often assumed to be sickness, misfortune, or even death for the victim and her family. Opara 2007. This so-called trafficking contract breeds the fear of reprisals for the trafficked victims, and as a result compels them to endure their suffering in silence. In some cases, some of the possessions taken from victims as part of the ritual are held by the traffickers, almost like owning a piece of the victim, so that no matter where he or she is, they are never far away from being destroyed. Ikeora 2014. Hence, running away is not usually perceived by some victims as a safer option. Where victimhood is measured by physical violence or abuse, this sort of covert violence, often more psychological than physical, may often be overlooked during the identification of victims of trafficking. According to Opara 2007, this psychological coercion has proved most productive for traffickers of African women, mostly due to the traditional belief in ancestral spirits and the supernatural held by some African communities. Before traffickers procure the travel documents as part of the trafficking process, victims undergo this oath-taking ritual in a chosen shrine, declaring to pay back their debts as well as obey their madam or oga, OGA, their traffickers, under all circumstances. The amount of this debt is sometimes agreed during or before the ritual is performed and can range from between 500 English pounds and 12,000 English pounds, or more in some cases. This oath-taking ritual serves as a contract between the trafficker and the victim for the purpose of allegiance, secrecy, confidentiality, and repayment of the cost of her journey, as well as other expenses incurred in the process, all of which are solely determined by the trafficker. Opara 2007. As a survivor indicated, I did the voodoo oath in exchange for the transport. Alps 2008. Another survivor said, I was obliged to do Juju several times during the journey. I was obliged to do it, otherwise it would have been as if we didn't trust them. It was so that we wouldn't talk to the police. There are several reasons why it is not easy for these victims to refuse this oath-taking. For one, the victims often view the trafficker as a helper or a good Samaritan, and may even volunteer to take the oath to reassure the trafficker of their allegiance in exchange for an anticipated opportunity for a better life. Opara 2007. In many cases, it is for victims to agree easily to paying the outrageous monetary fees and therefore the debts assigned to them by their traffickers. The traffickers generally rely on the ignorance of the victims when assigning these debts. In many cases, these victims are recruited from rural areas, mainly villages, and may have no real concept of a sum equivalent to these debts in their national currency. Others who are aware of the equivalents are deceived into believing that they would earn that money back in a short space of time, from a few months to a maximum of a year, a completely unreasonable assumption in the context of their emigration. In most cases, the victims are tied to these debts for many years, and when they are still unable to pay them, they are kept in slavery until their trafficker has no use for them. Bales 2000. The implication of this oath-taking is not only harmful to the victims, but can also be detrimental to anti-trafficking efforts, especially for law enforcement. The fear that this oath-taking generates for many of these victims often serves as a hindrance to investigation and prosecution of traffickers, while in some cases it also prevents obstacles to the protection of these victims. Investigations may be disrupted because victims are scared to give concrete information to law enforcement authorities due to the oath that they have sworn. As a result, the reality of the victims may, in some cases, be inconsistent with the information that they decide to provide, often resulting in criminals escaping convictions. The lack of evidence may also be due to the victims believing themselves the protection of this element of African traditional religion. According to Agazu 2013, an African scholar of African traditional religion and culture, for many Nigerian organized criminals who have little or no business with the doctrines of the new religions, Juju oaths form part of their initiation procedures. The oaths may also be used to recover debts or settle disputes when violence is not considered as an option for whatever reason. The fear of being destroyed or even killed by Juju would normally compel a member to remain compliant to any agreement reached under the oath. Those in the diaspora are not left out, as Africans are fond of upholding their popular cultures wherever they are. Victims who have undergone this oath-taking ritual believe that if they disclose this experience or give evidence about their trafficker, they will experience a number of tragedies. Some tragedies may include being killed, experiencing mental illness, and the torment of the family of the victims through illness or death, amongst other types of causes to which the victims have agreed during the ritual ceremony. Agazu 2013, also claims that trafficked women who have undergone these rituals become mentally enslaved. For these reasons, alongside the traditional beliefs held by these victims, they may often lie about their experiences, in keeping with the oath they have taken to protect themselves. This fear may be further intensified by the panic that these victims often feel when they are interviewed or assessed by law enforcement authorities. According to one NAPTIP official in 2012, a certain number of the victims identified in Europe frequently fear that European officials may not understand their belief system and are therefore reluctant to relay their stories. Interrogating and interviewing victims of this type of trafficking has been a subject of great difficulty for practitioners in Europe, as confirmed by the anti-trafficking authorities in the United Kingdom. Desmond, 2009. These problems often arise from factors such as mistrust and a lack of cultural understanding, which often prevent practitioners from asking the right questions in order to generate the needed rapport. Some victims tend to exhibit elements of memory loss. They often indicate that they are unable to remember their experiences in great detail, trying to suppress the thoughts of their experiences, or tending to live in the denial of their experiences. Moreover, they often feel shame or disgust, some blaming themselves for playing a part in such a ritual. This is because traditional oaths are generally perceived as abhorrent, even by some Africans who now align themselves to mainstream religions like Christianity, amongst others. ATR practitioners, or African traditional religion practitioners, are often seen as devil worshippers by those who practice Christianity and Islam. However, Oba insists that even some Christians will still practice elements of ATR and often defend such practices with Bible passages in Luke, Mark, Matthew, which say, "Then give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's." They interpret this to mean that Jesus supports their patronage to other gods whenever they feel the need to do so, as at Agazu 2013. Nevertheless, where practitioners, including law enforcement authorities, suspect that a person has been trafficked, they may be further challenged by the victim's inability to testify against his or her trafficker due to the oath, amongst other reasons. However, in many cases, the victims who experience this nature of trafficking tend to mistrust law enforcement authorities, who are unable to conclude that they, the victims, are trafficked due to the lack of information, as well as concern that some victims try to use trafficking and such bogus claims of Juju in order to gain asylum or offset immigration laws. This has been evident in the disproportionately large number of conclusions of trafficking cases of non-European nationals who are identified and assessed through the UK National Referral Mechanism, the NRM, a system intended to ascertain whether an individual has truly been trafficked. A positive conclusion within this identification mechanism usually equates to victims receiving most of the support and the protection that they require. However, a negative conclusion or rejection may lead to the deportation of victims and the denial of any protection, which may also lead to the re-trafficking of these victims. Arosha 2010. Victims who are not able to give evidence due to oath-taking fall into the latter category, thereby affecting their protection and overall jeopardizing the 3 Ps: protection, prosecution, and prevention of anti-trafficking. The implication of this element in evidence-based investigation of ATR has proven to be detrimental to the significant efforts being made to eradicate human trafficking so far, both in the prosecution and conviction of traffickers, and also for the protection of victims as illustrated. It demonstrates that there is a significant need to understand this concept of oath-taking and Juju in order to devise better ways of addressing the obfuscations that provide obstacles to tackling trafficking cases. For this reason, clarifying the practice of Juju as a concept within the scholarship of African traditional religion is crucial to demystifying the misconceptions that currently impede anti-trafficking within this context. Juju and oath-taking as a concept. Juju, as most people in West Africa call it, can be defined as a fetish or charm believed by, but not limited to, West Africans to have magical or supernatural powers, mostly vindictive. It forms part of an African traditional belief system, one which takes diverse forms and practices in different cultures and traditions. For instance, the practice exists differently across various communities and ethnic groups just within Nigeria and is thus given different names. And this broadness is a country like Nigeria with 3 major tribes and over 250 different ethnic groups. Hence, Juju as a name given to this practice is just one of the many names given across the different ethno-national groups in Nigeria. Juju is depicted in many Nollywood movies. Nollywood is Hollywood in Nigeria. Juju is depicted in many Nollywood movies, nurtures the negative stereotype often ascribed to ATR, reflecting belief systems rooted in the fear of destructive spiritual forces within a perverted cosmology. Additionally, it recuperates a discourse that denies anything of value in ATR, whose moral positioning in terms of what it really is, good versus evil, God versus the devil, is no less sacred than those religions that would assault it. On the other hand, oath-taking is an acceptable practice and a common feature of the customary law resolution of disputes in certain parts of Africa. Oregbunam, no date. It is also situated in ATR. According to Anunwa, oath-taking is a religious and judicial system of swearing in the name of a deity, happening either before or at the shrine of a dreaded deity. Anunwa 2010. Usually in cases where the intricacies of the matter are difficult to resolve. According to Okuri 2009, oath-taking is a situation where absolute loyalty or adherence to certain agreement and conditionality is prescribed and administered to the beneficiaries of the agreement, and the exercise is usually fetish. Oviasuyi 2011 et al. Parties to the oath-taking directly submit to the supernatural tribune to settle disputes brought before the deity. The tribune's verdict is final. The oaths are worded in such a way that the swearer invokes a conditional curse upon himself or herself, which may include death or illness. It is often the belief of the swearers that should they default, the misfortune they agreed to will befall them through the powers of the gods. This oath-taking and the fear of misfortune is what comes to play in human trafficking cases, as the above case studies have illustrated. However, oath-taking is often dismissed or misrepresented as Juju because of its fetish nature. Oath-taking can often be confused for Juju because they are both frequently performed before the shrines of various deities, or so-called Juju shrines. Some of these deities seen in Nigeria include Efe, Arusi, and Ayelala, all of whom possess different powers and operate in different ways. The priest or priestess of some of these deities can sometimes perform Juju rituals against another person when requested by their client. However, these sorts of ritual cannot be mistaken for the oath-taking utilized by traffickers. It is important to note that many African deities are associated with bringing justice and peace to the communities that believe and serve it. Therefore, Juju cannot be amenable to them. It is often the same belief that traps the victims of traffickers. Some victims may concur that if they default from their agreement with the trafficker, the deity will kill them or their family. Even though some of these victims are Christians, they still believe in the potency of the oath that they have taken. Despite the introduction of Islam and Christianity to Africa, oath-taking remains deeply rooted not just in the African traditional belief systems, but also in the legal system of some African countries. Some Africa scholars contend that superstition in Nigeria is institutionalized and even legally endorsed in some parts of the country, Agazu 2013. It even plays a decisive role in the arbitration of Nigerian customary law and is accorded due respect in the courts as juridicially valuable. Oba 2008. Scholars like Oba assert that oaths form part of the supernatural, which plays a key role in both customary law as well as aiding crime detection. According to Ikenga Metu 1981, in spite of Western influences, oath-taking has survived as a legitimate judicial method which the Igbo believe in, and to be one of the assured ways of obtaining absolute justice. Several arbitration cases have acknowledged the legal validity of oath-taking, including those of Charles Ume versus Godfrey Okononkwo and Anor, and in the case of Afomata and Oz versus Anoka. According to Agbakoba, oath-taking is a recognized and accepted form of proof existing in certain customary judicature. Oaths may be sworn extrajudicial, but as a mode of judicial proof, its esoteric and reverential feature, the solemnity of the choice of an oath by the disputants and imminent evil visitation to the oath-breaker if he swore falsely, are the deterrent sanctions of this form of customary judicial process, which commends it alike to rural and urban indigenous courts. It is therefore my view that the decision to swear an oath is not illegal, although it may be obnoxious to Christian ethics. Oregbunam 2009. Regardless of its validity within the Nigerian legal system, oath-taking in trafficking is a sham contract between traffickers and their victim. Opara 2007. Nonetheless, it may seem verbally clear to the victims that they have agreed to the terms and conditions of the contract out of their free will, as seen in the case study used in this article. According to Basayuni 1991, the assumed elements of free choice, consent, and freedom may leave of free choice, consent, and freedom to leave may technically negate the applicability of international instruments to this subject. However, the same international law stipulates that an individual cannot renounce their liberty and freedom for the benefit of another party in a contract. As Kant puts it, a contract by which one party would completely renounce its freedom for another's advantage would be self-contradictory, that is, null and void. Gregor, 1996. Human trafficking as slavery has attained the status of jus cogens, or preemptory norms, as provided in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, 1969. That said, the extent to which such information about the law may influence the fear and belief of victims is extremely limited. The combination of the literacy of the law and ignorance also means that the victims are often unaware of their options. It is the obligation of the governments of prominent source countries or regions to protect their citizens from such psychological abuse and entrapment. Edo State in Nigeria is protuberant of this nature of trafficking, and the government within this region has endeavoured to introduce legislation to address this nature of trafficking. The Edo State Criminal Code, Section 233A, in Nigeria was amended to include the criminalisation of the administration of any form of oath performed by a woman or girl to travel out of Nigeria for the purpose of prostitution. However, traffickers tend to resort to other tactics to bypass existing laws. Opara 2007. Despite the aforementioned international legal objections to the use of oaths to enslave persons, it is the traditional belief of these women that this contract is spiritually binding and will harm them if they deflate, that stands as a massive threat and keeps victims in bondage. Traffickers use different shrines with different deities, some of whose concept of justice is limited to the agreement itself, rather than the very nature and circumstance of the agreement. Hence, it may seem that they have no notion of morality. For instance, according to Metu, 1981, whenever Arusi is invoked on somebody, it blindly kills him whether he is at fault or not. Hence, existing laws do not make much difference to how victims view the threat posed due to their deep-rooted belief system founded upon religious and cultural understanding. It is against this backdrop that this practice compels further clarity within the rubric of African traditional religion. So what has African traditional religion got to do with this? Studying and Studying or comprehending Juju or traditional oath-taking for what it really is extends an insight into dealing with the peculiarities of the context of human trafficking as has been discussed so far. As a concept, African traditional religion, ATR, better explicates what seems like a complex element entwined in the human trafficking of today. For most Africans, religion is the fundamental, perhaps the most important influence upon their lives, yet its essential principles are too often unfamiliar to foreigners who are often prone to misunderstanding the African worldview and its beliefs. Awolalu, 1976. African traditional religion is simply the indigenous beliefs and practices of Africans. Whilst we must be conscious of the fact that Africa is a large continent with a myriad of complex cultures and languages, religion is used in the singular here because, in spite of the aforementioned differences, there are many basic similarities in Africans' religious systems. These include the concept of God, although presented with different names, and the concept of divinities, spirits, and/or ancestors. Although practiced and named differently across Africa, Awolalu contends that there is a noticeable Africanness in its pattern of practice. One of the biggest problems in addressing the role of ATR in human trafficking is the ill-acknowledged notion of traditional oath-taking as part of ATR. This stems from the long-standing ways in which many Western ATR theorists have presented religion in Africa, often referring to Africa as a dark continent, where its people have no concept of God, at least in the way it is popularly viewed and/or accepted. The practice of ATR has often been derogated as primitive, pagan, fetishistic, animistic, and involving Juju, as currently used by making practitioners within the context of human trafficking. In fact, the word Juju, which has been used in this paper, originates from the French language, meaning a little doll or a toy. Awolalu, 1976. The word Juju is a misleading and derogatory term which has been commonly used out of either sheer prejudice or ignorance. Keeping this in mind, we should begin to move away from the current nomenclature of ascribing all oath-taking in ATR as Juju or voodoo, especially in the context of human trafficking. Oath-taking in ATR, as previously illustrated in this paper, is quite complex and diverse across cultures. It is not therefore clear-cut when trying to make sense out of it in practice. However, understanding the extent to which the victim's belief system has been abused by the trafficker will offer significant insight into ways in which protection and support can be meaningful to victims. Hence, as part of ATR, this belief system cannot be undermined. In support of the long-standing argument that ATR should be recognized alongside other mainstream religions, including Christianity and Islam, this section argues for such recognition in this context of human trafficking rather than relegating it to brainwashing. Brainwashing has been the popular explanation in the part of many law enforcement authorities and other practitioners in regard to the link between oath-taking and human trafficking. Relegating the ATR trafficking nexus to mere brainwashing does not only support the long-standing demonization of ATR, but also undermines the ability to bring forth the dilemma into mainstream anti-trafficking discourse. The latter consequently impacts upon the eradication of human trafficking. Another fundamental point to be noted is the influence of the deep-rooted belief system of African victims of trafficking on their belief in the reprisal of the oath they have taken at the shrines of different deities. Firstly, it is important to clear up the misconception of such belief systems as brainwashing. Brainwashing involves a serious confusion in this context because it singles out a particular religion that shares similar core features with other mainstream religions. It is, after all, uncommon for a practitioner to relegate a victim's belief in Christianity as brainwashing, such as is seen with ATR. Such insensitivity also negatively impacts upon the rapport that most practitioners or caseworkers try to build with victims who have strong ATR beliefs. Brainwashing as a practice includes pressuring someone into adopting radically different beliefs by using systematic and often forcible means. Singer, 2003. Edward Hunter first introduced the term brainwashing in 1951 through the publication of his book Brainwashing in Red China. Singer adds that brainwashing can be described as a process of manipulating and controlling an individual, in particular to keep them unaware that they are being moved along a negative path of change that is only in the interest of their manipulator. It is also described in terms of coordinated programs of coercive influence, behavior control, and exploitative persuasion. Singer, 2003. In the case of ATR, African victims already believe in ATR and do not require brainwashing to instill fear. This is why such a method of control is not potent amongst European victims of trafficking. The trafficker merely takes advantage of an existing belief and abuses it. Essentially, traffickers do not need to control the way the victims think of the oath, other than the very nature of the oath being taken and the reprisal to which the victim agrees. As with other religions, ATR possesses both good and bad elements, with human beings as its primary actors. Some people may use their positions of power within certain religions as a means to exploit others, and this has been seen, for instance, in both child abuse cases in churches and madrasas in the UK. Cherty and Bradley, 2011. It has proved important for practitioners to condemn the act of abuse in these established religions rather than condemn the religious belief system. As such, it has been important to work with church leaders and imams in dealing with such abuse in their institutions. The same process or approach should be accredited to ATR and the priest or priestess who have abused their positions through performing rites that encourage human trafficking. When the priest or priestess of various deities perform the oath-taking rituals for traffickers, they become accomplices in human trafficking and should therefore be accorded some level of conviction, especially when they are aware it is for trafficking purposes. On the other hand, some of them may perform these rituals to establish a contract between the traffickers and their victims, without the awareness that they are enabling trafficking. The latter highlights the importance of educating these priests and priestesses on trafficking and engaging in anti-trafficking efforts, particularly within this context. In light of the above clarification of trafficking within this context, abstaining from the use of brainwashing to describe this issue may begin to open up new horizons for understanding and addressing human trafficking comprehensively, not just in Africa, but in other parts of the world where traffickers abuse the belief system of people in order to exploit them. Although this article focuses on Africa and Nigeria specifically, some scholars have highlighted the idea of karmic debt as a system used across South Asia to oppress people of scheduled castes in the caste system, or the notion of voodoo in Haiti, from Farrell 2011. He quotes, or they quote, "Even in Guatemala, traffickers use witch doctors to threaten their female victims of trafficking. In 2009, 5 members of one family were convicted of trafficking Guatemalan girls into Los Angeles for sex work, using beatings and threats against their families. They also employed witch doctors to threaten the girls with curses." Although not all of the victims rely upon the superior powers of deities in Africa, they still fear its existence against their openly practiced mainstream religions. Some of these trafficked women are practicing Christians and using their Christian faith as a shield of protection from fear of the oath that they have taken. Alps, 2008. To further emphasize the complicated social milieu within which the oath-taking practice takes place, it is noted that some Christians or Muslims still practice such cultural tradition covertly. Akosh Sarpong, 2007. As such, Alps 2008, assertion that Christianity shields one from Juju is still a question of faith, which most Christians in Africa still find difficult to embrace due to a deep-rooted belief system that even a colonial influence was unable to permanently uproot. The crux of this article is not to assert the validity of religious cultural practices, but rather to present a clearer understanding of the source of fear for trafficked victims trapped by this method of control. In clarifying the context of this mode of trafficking, one can begin to consider better measures, not just for protecting the victims of trafficking, but breaking down a significant control mechanism that remains a hindrance to anti-trafficking measures. It is therefore recommended that anti-trafficking stakeholders in the form of governments, law enforcement authorities, NGOs, and other international organizations should begin to engage with this context in their discourse on anti-trafficking. The engagement of religious leaders is also important, one not being limited to the so-called mainstream religions, but beginning to involve traditional leaders who have significant influence in their communities where traditional oath-taking is practiced. Their denouncement of human trafficking is crucial towards eliminating this new method of control in the modern slavery of human trafficking. In conclusion, without doubt, there is more research to be done in addressing this nature of trafficking. This article takes a step towards demystifying the current understanding of African traditional beliefs linked to human trafficking. Many case studies of trafficking, especially from Nigeria, have been challenged with this nature of trafficking. That is, where victims are made to swear an oath to bind them to the control of their traffickers. Despite the misassumptions about this type of trafficking, one thing is conclusive. Traffickers abuse the belief system of these victims in order to keep them in perpetual fear, not just of escaping, but also of reporting the crime to the relevant authorities. This emerging control mechanism has complicated the protection of victims and the prosecution of traffickers, thereby generating a clear need to understand and address the dilemma. Currently, anti-trafficking practitioners in Europe have relegated this nature of control to brainwashing. Such misunderstanding attacks the belief system of the victims, denying the agency of victims and, as a result, affecting their rapport with the law enforcement authorities. This article clarifies that the link of African traditional religion to trafficking is not consistent with the concept of brainwashing, although there is a consensus concerning the element of deceit in the process. This is not an argument for the validity of this religion, but rather the acceptance. This is not an argument for the validity of this religion, but rather the acceptance that the fear experienced by victims stems from their deep-rooted belief systems. Therefore, any attempt to address the nature of trafficking must start with an understanding of these fears and their impact on anti-trafficking. As it currently stands, the poor understanding of this context of trafficking by the relevant stakeholders has been detrimental to the identification of victims and anti-trafficking as a whole. Therefore, we ought to find new ways or approaches that consider this context of trafficking in order to make significant progress on the anti-trafficking crusade. That is the end of the article. Thank you so much if you have listened to the end of this article, the end of this podcast. I apologize retrospectively if it was interrupting to hear me give the references of all the contributors to this article. But I felt that it was useful if you're listening from the point of anti-trafficking crusade, anti-trafficking lawmaking, policy making, law enforcement, NGO support to people who are victims of trafficking, survivors of trafficking. By knowing the references on the various points and claims that I made in the article, you can then look to the end of the article for all of these references and pick out very quickly another text or another article that might well relate to the work that you are engaged in or you want to take further interest in. There is also a list of all of the publications used in development for this article by May Ikeora, including a list of website references and documentaries, videos, and interviews that were broadcast on television that obviously provide further triangulation of these ideas. Thank you very much. You have been listening to the Arcs and Orcs podcast by Sasha Wallace. I'll see you on the next message.